Morris, friends of Josephine, Secretary of State and distinguished guests, Mary and I are delighted to welcome you to the Embassy and to thank you for joining us this evening for this celebration of Josephine Hart. The Irish Embassy has, over the decades, hosted many important cultural events. But I doubt if the Embassy has ever had the honour of welcoming to a single event guests, writers and actors who have more enriched the English language with their pen and their voice, or who have more deepened our understanding of the world. I'm also particularly pleased to welcome many people who in the theatre, media, academia and the publishing world have helped to create an environment for poetry and literature to flourish. I'm sure I speak for all of us in extending a special welcome to Seamus Heaney and Mary, who have travelled to London to be with us. Writing recently in The Telegraph, Maurice Saatchi recalled the hierarchical system taught to Josephine by the nuns at her St. Louis school near Mullingar. Novels good, theatre better, poetry best. My speech this evening in simple prose doesn't even register in that hierarchy. In the presence of writers and actors of such distinction, both on the podium and in the audience, the best thing for me would probably be to take the simple advice in one of Seamus Heaney's poems, whatever you say nothing. Nevertheless, there are a few brief but important things I would like to say at the outset of the evening. I take heart from the fact that Sebastian Coe was a guest here a couple of months ago, and he's a living reminder of how much it's possible to achieve in 3.5 minutes, so I will be brief. But I hope in this Olympic year you'll allow me a few words. We're here, it seems to me, to celebrate 4 things. First and foremost, of course, we're here to celebrate Josephine Hart. Last year, not knowing of her illness, I tried to contact her a number of times to offer to host one of her poetry evenings at the Embassy. Then, like all of you this evening, I learned with deep shock of her death. Later last year, I wrote to Maurice to suggest a poetry evening in honour of Josephine, and I'm very grateful to Maurice for his support and encouragement for this event. There are many people here this evening, of course, who knew Josephine much longer and better than I did. I knew her enough, however, to recognise in her an exceptionally formidable, creative and courageous person, enough to have a small flavour of her unique personal qualities about which many have written in recent months, including her capacity for friendship, her kindness and her passion for bringing poetry to a wider audience. The launch of the Josephine Hart Poetry app is an imaginative, practical and living tribute to that passion. In many ways, Josephine is with us this evening. She is with us through the community of friends gathered here to remember her and to celebrate her. She is with us in the very Yeats programme which we are about to enjoy, which was drawn up by Josephine herself. And she is with us in the capacity of poetry, as reflected perhaps most strikingly in Shakespeare's sonnets, to transcend the inevitability of time and to ensure that despite time's cruel hand, love can and does endure. But thy eternal summer shall not fade, nor lose possession of that fair thou owest, nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade, when in eternal lines to time thou growest. The second thing we celebrate this evening is the exceptional warmth of relations between Britain and Ireland, to which Josephine herself, a great Irish woman, contributed so much through her friendships, her intellect and her courage. In 2012, relations between Britain and Ireland are closer than ever before. Last year's immensely successful visit to Ireland by Her Majesty the Queen confirmed that the closeness of our geography has at last become more important than the divisions of our history. It proved that 2 countries, which perhaps more than any other 2 countries in history have been known for their rivalry, have now become the very closest of friends. And that friendship between our countries and governments created the context for the Northern Ireland peace process, which, despite its imperfections, is now the envy of the world. And I'm delighted that Secretary of State Owen Paterson, Minister Hugo Swire and Labour spokesman in Northern Ireland Vernon Coker are all with us this evening. The third thing we celebrate this evening is Irish culture. Suffice it to say that we may be a small country, but we're a literary superpower, and some of the most powerful weapons in our cultural arsenal are with us this evening. And finally this evening we celebrate poetry itself, and as we come to the poetry, that naturally is where I shut up, except to agree with Shakespeare as we celebrate Josephine this evening, that so long as men can breathe, our eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. You're all, of course, very welcome to stay for a drink, and Mary and I hope you will do so after the readings, and I'm delighted now to call on Professor Roy Foster to introduce the programme.
Thank you, Ambassador and Maurice. The words you'll hear from my mouth tonight will be mostly Josephine's. Her inimitable, succinct introductions to poetry always cut to the bone perceptive, often profound, never pretentious, just like the woman herself. Knowing Josephine meant a continual conversation, deeply engaged, and one of our few disagreements was in fact about poetry. When I unwisely said something about her beloved T.S. Eliot's poetic range and imagination being slightly inferior to Yeats's. Her contrary opinion was expressed with her habitual force, and I remarked as I metaphorically picked myself up off the floor, "Now you'll never speak to me again." This provoked another vehement reaction. "Listen, Roy Foster, when I'm a friend for life." This was true. Friendship, as the ambassador has said, like poetry, was one of the things Josephine didn't joke about and took very seriously. As we'll hear later, Yeats, whom we celebrate with Josephine tonight, wrote, "Think where men's glory most begins and ends, and say my glory was I had such friends." If you're a friend of Josephine's, as so many here tonight, you could say the same. The rest of my words are hers. When he died in 1939 at the age of 73 at a house in Cap Martin in the south of France, William Butler Yeats was buried in the local churchyard. "If I die here," he'd said, "bury me here. Then in a year's time, when the papers have forgotten me, dig me up and plant me in Sligo." Well, it took rather longer than a year. In 1948, his body was returned to be buried, as he'd requested, in Drumcliff Churchyard under Bear Ben Bulman's head, in the Sligo he'd loved since childhood. His headstone famously reads, "Cast a cold eye on life, on death, horseman pass by." It's a compelling and enigmatic epitaph, for the man who advises us to cast a cold eye had engaged with life, with love, with art, with an almost overwhelming passion. That tension was perhaps the fulcrum in which the poetry was created. Poetry, he once said, is made out of the quarrel with oneself. He was born on the 13th of June, 1865, in Sandymount, Dublin. His father, a barrister, was John Butler Yeats, the son and grandson of rectors in the Church of Ireland. His mother, Susan Polexfen, whose shipbuilding family came from Sligo, drenched his mind with the fairy folklore of the area. In 1868, his father gave up his practice to study painting in London with the Pre-Raphaelites. Not an easy decision with a growing family. It was a lived lesson about what matters in life. One of Yeats's sisters said, "When I look back on Papa's life, I marvel at his gay courage, talking literature and art and life, and no income at all." Well, he lived to see one son become one of the world's greatest poets, another, Jack B. Yeats, one of Ireland's greatest painters, and his two daughters, Lily and Lolly, set up and ran the famous Cuala Press. That's what I call achievement. Yeats eventually attended the Godolphin School in Hammersmith, not happily, where, and this is an utterly irrelevant piece of information, but one which I find enchanting, he became the best high diver in the school. Since years later, Ezra Pound taught him to fence, and he was an excellent fisherman, Yeats, the poet and sportsman, just begs to be written. Eventually, Yeats returned to Dublin and, deemed not clever enough to go on to Trinity College, studied painting at the School of Art. Then, in one of literature's luckiest volte-face, he turned instead to poetry, and aged 24, published The Wanderings of Oisin, written in English, based on Irish mythology, the richness of which he believed rivaled Greece. His early poetry was, as Seamus Heaney points out, countercultural to the realism of the Victorians. In that counterculturalism, the soul of 20th century Ireland was formed. The mystical is at the center of all that I do, all that I think, and all that I write. His acknowledged influences were from the apocalyptic Blake and Shelley, also obsessed with the occult. Swedenborg, the 18th century philosopher and mystic, and the notorious Madame Blavatsky, holder of seances and founder of the Theosophical Society. "You were silly like us," Auden wrote in his wonderful poem in memory of W.B. Yeats. "But it is not silly to know what it is your genius requires to nourish its roots. It's in fact a form of genius." And all his life, Yeats pushed at the doors of perception in pursuit of art and truth. The three early dream poems with which we open, The Stolen Child, The Host of the Air, and The Song of Wandering Angus, are poems in which the repetition of sound and image are designed to suggest a mood to lure the listener to the threshold of sleep. In each, someone has been stolen away. Yeats was 8 when his brother Robert died, and he remembered his mother crying and the sound of a horse's hooves galloping away to get the doctor. A poet, he said, always writes out of his personal life, in his finest work out of its tragedy. He never speaks directly. There is always a phantasmagoria. There was indeed. Yeats often wrote in assumed persona, the concept of the mask crucial to him. James Joyce, who incidentally, when he met Yeats, allegedly said, "I've met you too late, you're too old for me to help you." James Joyce noted that Yeats had a surrealist imagination few painters could match. That imagination is clear in these strange and haunting poems.
The Stolen Child. Where dips the rocky highland of Sleuth Wood in the lake, there lies a leafy island where flapping herons wake the drowsy water rats. There we've hid our fairy vats, full of berries and of reddest stolen cherries. Come away, O human child, to the waters and the wild with a fairy, hand in hand, for the world's more full of weeping than you can understand. Where the wave of moonlight glosses the dim grey sands with light, far off by furthest Rosses, we foot it all the night, weaving olden dances, mingling hands and mingling glances till the moon has taken flight. To and fro we leap and chase the frothy bubbles, while the world is full of troubles and anxious in its sleep. Come away, O human child, to the waters and the wild with a fairy, hand in hand, for the world's more full of weeping than you can understand. Where the wandering water gushes from the hills above Glencar, in pools among the rushes that scarce could bathe a star, we seek for slumbering trout, and whispering in their ears, give them unquiet dreams. Leaning softly out from ferns that drop their tears over the young streams, come away, O human child, to the waters and the wild with a fairy, hand in hand, for the world's more full of weeping than you can understand. Away with us he's going, the solemn-eyed. He'll hear no more the lowing of the calves on the warm hillside, or the kettle on the hob sing peace into his breast, or see the brown mice bob round and round the oatmeal chest. For he comes, the human child, to the waters and the wild, with a fairy, hand in hand, for the world's more full of weeping than he can understand.
The Host of the Air. O'Driscoll drove with a song, the wild duck and the drake, from the tall and tufted reeds of the drear Hart Lake. And he saw how the reeds grew dark at the coming of night tide, and dreamed of the long, dim hair of Bridget, his bride. He heard while he sang and dreamed a piper piping away, and never was piping so sad, and never was piping so gay. And he saw young men and young girls who danced on a level place, and Bridget, his bride, among them, with a sad and a gay face. The dancers crowded about him, and many a sweet thing said, and a young man brought him red wine, and a young girl white bread. But Bridget drew him by the sleeve away from the merry bands to old men playing at cards with the twinkling of ancient hands. The bread and the wine had a doom, for these were the host of the air. He sat and played in a dream of her long, dim hair. He played with the merry old men and thought not of evil chance, until one bore Bridget his bride away from the merry dance. He bore her away in his arms, the handsomest man that was there, and his neck and his breast and his arms were drowned in her long dim hair. O'Driscoll scattered the cards, and out of his dream awoke. Old men and young girls were gone like a drifting smoke. But he heard, high up in the air, a piper piping away. And never was piping so sad, and never was piping so gay.
Song of the Wandering Angels. I went out to the hazelwood because a fire was in my head, and cut and peeled a hazel wand, and hooked a berry to a thread. And when white moths were on the wing, and moth-like stars were flickering out, I dropped the berry in a stream, and caught a little silver trout. When I had laid it on the floor, I went to blow the fire aflame, but something rustled on the floor, and someone called me by my name. It had become a glimmering girl with apple blossom in her hair, who called me by my name and ran and faded through the brightening air. Though I am old with wandering through hollow lands and hilly lands, I will find out where she has gone and kiss her lips and take her hands, and walk among long dappled grass and pluck till time and times are done the silver apples of the moon, the golden apples of the sun.
Ezra Pound said, Yeats knows life. He learns by emotion, and is one of the few people who knows what violent emotion really is like, who sees from the center of it, instead of trying to look in from the rim. Well, the violent emotion was inspired by Maud Gonne. In 1889, she arrived in the Yeats household and instantly took possession of his soul. When the soul is lost to woman, all is lost. He was 24, a just-published poet. She had read an earlier play, The Island of Statues, which obsessed her. There's something of Lizzie Siddal in his description of her, as she stood there in her youthful beauty, 23, an ex-debutante, extremely tall, flaming bronze hair, and strange, angry eyes. He saw her as a luminous vision, but it was her passionate nature which began all the trouble of his life, and which was to inspire some of the greatest love poetry ever written. He'd found the love of his life, she'd found a poet for the cause. He was doomed from the start, for though he didn't know it at the time, and he would later say, she was complete when I met her, I was not, she was in love with the married Lucien Millevoye, with whom she would have 2 children out of wedlock, a boy who died and a daughter, Iseult, of whom more later. Millevoye was a French right-wing revolutionary and journalist, as involved with politics as she was, including the Irish nationalist cause. Yeats's obsession with Maud Gonne lasted all his life. He proposed endlessly, but she would become neither mistress nor wife. Though years later the relationship was consummated, Maud's suggestion that they pledge themselves afterwards to a mystical union of brother and sister couldn't have been reassuring. This magnificent, brave, and talented woman, who took the lead in the Countess Kathleen, was also dangerous and violent, with a fanatical love of Ireland, though not Irish herself. She was twice imprisoned for her activities and was eventually buried in Glasnevin Cemetery with Ireland's heroes. Yeats wrote of her, she lived in storm and strife. Her soul had such desire for what proud death may bring that it could not endure the common good of life. And therein lies the pity. And yet, for all the pain she caused, there is, I think, little cause for regret. Here is a fascinating quote from him about the nature of obsession. All our lives long, as Da Vinci says, we long for our destruction. And how, when we find it in the shape of a most fair woman, can we do less than leave all others for her? Do we not seek our dissolution on her lips? He understood the erotic. Of Olivia Shakespeare, the married woman with whom he first experienced sexual love, he wrote, she was too wholesome to my inmost being, an insight of which Freud would have been proud. Tragic ecstasy, Yeats believed, was the best that art, or perhaps life, can give us. Well, there was much tragic ecstasy with Maud Gonne. Her eventual marriage to Major John McBride, a man she believed had a stronger will than she had, which must have been something, was terrible for Yeats. Like lightning through me, he said. McBride was a revolutionary, as extreme as she. They spent part of their honeymoon allegedly reconnoitering assassination attempts for an impending royal visit to Gibraltar. Their union was a disaster, and they separated after 5 years. John McBride was executed with the leaders of the 1916 rebellion and is named by Yeats in Easter 1916. Again, Yeats, now 51, proposed, and again he was rejected in a strange Jamesian episode. Yeats, in despair, proposed to her daughter by Millevoye, Iseult, who wisely turned him down. Finally, Yeats married Georgie Hyde-Lees, who happily discovered her talent for automatic writing on their honeymoon and worked with Yeats on the extraordinary book A Vision. They had 2 adored children, Michael and Anne. Marriage in the shadow of Maud Gonne was not easy. Yeats once apologized to his wife for the persistence of Maud's image in his imagination. He said he went to sleep with the endeavor to send his soul to her. However, nearly on his deathbed, having read Maud's ironically titled A Servant of the Queen, the man who was deaf and blind and dumb with love commented with considerable coolness, "She had a remarkable intellect at the service of the will, no will at the service of the intellect." Brilliant. We open with short, passionate cries of hopeless love, cries of the heart against necessity. And in this section, we also have Adam's Curse, a conversation between Yeats, Maud Gonne, and her sister about art and beauty and love and the hidden effort in each. Then Leda and the Swan, the mythological savagery of the erotic. Then 2 short poems in the voice of a woman, The Mermaid and Before the World Was Made. We end this section with Friends. Now must I these 3 praise. The 3 are Olivia Shakespeare, Lady Gregory, and of course, Maud Gonne. 27 years after he'd met her, her very image makes him shake from head to foot. Long love indeed.
The pity of love, a pity beyond all telling, is hid in the heart of love. The folk who are buying and selling the clouds on their journey above, the cold, wet winds ever blowing, and the shadowy hazel grove where mouse-grey waters are flowing, threaten the head that I love. When you are old and grey and full of sleep and nodding by the fire, take down this book and slowly read and dream of the soft look your eyes had once and of their shadows deep. How many loved your moments of glad grace and loved your beauty with a love false or true? But one man loved the pilgrim soul in you and loved the sorrows of your changing face. And bending down beside the glowing bars, murmur a little sadly how love fled, and paced upon the mountains overhead, and hid his face amid a crowd of stars.
By the heavens embroidered cloth, enwrought with golden and silver light, the blue and the dim and the dark cloths of night and light and the half-light, I would spread those cloths under your feet. But I, being poor, have only my dreams. I have spread my dreams under your feet. Tread softly, because you tread on my dreams.
The folly of being comforted. One that is ever kind said yesterday, your well-beloved hair has threads of grey, and little shadows come about her eyes. Time can but make it easier to be wise, though now it seems impossible. And so all that you need is patience. Heart cries, no, I have not a crumb of comfort, not a grain. Time can but make her beauty over again, because of that great nobleness of hers. That fire that stirs about her when she stirs burns but more clearly. Oh, she had not these ways when all the wild summer was in her gaze. Oh heart, if she'd but turn her head, you'd know the folly of being comforted.
We sat together at one summer's end. That beautiful, wise woman, your good friend, and you and I, and talked of poetry. I said, a line will take us hours maybe. Yet if it does not seem a moment's thought, all our stitching and unstitching has been naught. Better get down upon your marrow bones and scrub a kitchen pavement or break stones like an old pauper in all sorts of weather. For to articulate sweet sounds together is to work harder than all these and yet be thought an idler by the noisy set of bankers, schoolmasters, and clergymen the martyrs call the world. And thereupon, that beautiful, mild woman, for whose sake there's many a one will find out all heartache on finding that her voice is sweet and low, replied, to be born woman is to know, although they do not talk of it at school, that we must labor to be beautiful. I said it's certain. There's no fine thing since Adam's fall, but needs much questioning. There have been lovers who have thought love should be so much compounded of high courtesy that they would sigh and quote with learned looks precedents out of beautiful old books. But now it seems an idle trade enough. We had grown quiet at the name of love. We saw the last embers of daylight die, and in the trembling blue-green of the sky, a moon, worn as if it had been a shell, washed by time's waters as they rose and fell about the stars and broke in days and years. I had a thought for no one but your ears, that you were beautiful, and that I loved you in the old highway of love, that we'd been happy, but now we'd grown as weary-hearted as that hollow moon.
Never give the heart, never give all the heart. Never give all the heart, for love will hardly seem worth thinking of to passionate women if it seems certain. And they never dream that it fades out from kiss to kiss, for everything that's lovely is but a brief, dreamy, kind delight. Oh, never give the heart outright, for they, for all smooth lips can say, have given their hearts up to play. And who could play it well enough if deaf and dumb and blind with love? He that made this knows all the cost, for he gave all his heart and lost.
Oh, do not love too long. Sweetheart, do not love too long. I loved long and long, and grew to be out of fashion like an old song. All through the years of our youth, neither could have known their own thought from the others. We were so much at one. But oh, in a minute she changed. Oh, do not love too long, or you will grow out of fashion like an old song. No second Troy. Why should I blame her that she filled my days with misery, or that she would of late have taught to ignorant men most violent ways, or hurled the little streets upon the great, had they but courage equal to desire? What could have made her peaceful, with a mind that nobleness made simple as a fire, with beauty like a tightened bow, a kind that is not natural in an age like this, being high and solitary and most stern? Why? What could she have done, being what she is? Was there another Troy for her to burn?
Words. I had thought this a while ago. My darling cannot understand what I have done or what would do in this blind, bitter land. And I grew weary of the sun until my thoughts cleared up again, remembering that the best I have done was done to make it plain. That every year I have cried, at length, my darling understands it all, because I have come into my strength, and words obey my call. That she had done so, who can say? What would have shaken from the sieve? I might have thrown poor words away and been content to live.
If any man drew near when I was young, I thought, he holds her dear, and shook with hate and fear. But oh, 'twas bitter wrong, if he could pass her by with an indifferent eye. Whereon I wrote and wrought, and now being grey, I dream that I have brought to such a pitch my thought that coming time can say, he shadowed in a glass what thing her body was. For she had fiery blood when I was young, and trod so sweetly proud as 'twere upon a cloud, a woman Homer sung, that life and letters seem but an heroic dream.
A drinking song. Wine comes in at the mouth, and love comes in at the eye. That's all we shall know for truth before we grow old and die. I lift the glass to my mouth, I look at you, and I sigh.
Leda and the Swan. A sudden blow. The great wings beating still above the staggering girl. Her thighs caressed by the dark webs, her nape caught in his bill. He holds her helpless breast upon his breast. How can those terrified, vague fingers push the feathered glory from her loosening thighs? And how can body laid in that white rush but feel the strange heart beating where it lies? A shudder in the loins engenders there the broken wall, the burning roof and tower, and Agamemnon dead. Being so caught up, so mastered by the brute blood of the air, did she put on his knowledge with his power before the indifferent beak could let her drop? The Mermaid. A mermaid found a swimming lad, picked him for her own, pressed her body to his body, laughed, and plunging down, forgot in cruel happiness that even lovers drown.
Before the world was made, if I make the lashes dark and the eyes more bright and the lips more scarlet, or ask if it be all right from mirror after mirror, no vanities displayed, I'm looking for the face I had before the world was made. What if I look upon a man as though on my beloved, and my blood be cold the while, and my heart unmoved? Why should he think me cruel, or that he is betrayed? I'd have him love the thing that was before the world was made. Friends, now must I these three praise, three women who have wrought what joy is in my days. One because no thought nor those on passing cares, no, not in these 15 many times troubled years, could ever come between mind and delighted mind. And one because her hand had strength that could unbind what none can understand, what none can have and thrive, youth's dreamy load, till she so changed me that I live laboring in ecstasy. And what of her that took all my youth was gone? With scarce a pitying look, how could I praise that one? When day begins to break, I count my good and bad, being wakeful for her sake, remembering what she had, what eagle look still shows, while up from my heart's roots so great a sweetness flows, I shake from head to foot.
Yeats, wrote Eliot, is one of those few poets whose history is the history of their own time, who are a part of the consciousness of an age which cannot be understood without them. And, he continued, this is a very high position to assign him, but I believe it is one which is secure. Eliot, of course, is right. Yeats, not only in his poetry, but in the plays which he wrote and commissioned for the Abbey Theatre, which he founded with Lady Gregory, was central to the creation of modern Ireland. And in 1923, when Yeats, at 58, was awarded the Nobel Prize, what was the subject of his speech? A modest and generous speech calling up the ghost of John Millington Synge to stand beside him. It did not deal with poetry. He said, I have chosen as my theme the Irish dramatic movement. Had my lyric poetry not had the quality of speech spoken on the stage, I would not be here, nor would I be here were I not the symbol of a movement. When we thought of the plays we would like to perform, we thought of everything that was romantic and poetical, for the nationalism we had called up in moments of discouragement was romantic and poetical. Well, up to a point. These romantic and poetical plays were to cause riots. Yeats had a genius for spotting and encouraging genius in others. Synge, whom he met in Paris, was very delicate. He was persuaded by Yeats to go to the bleak and bitter Aran Islands to write The Playboy of the Western World. When Yeats protested, but I'll die there, when Synge protested, but I'll die there, Yeats replied, not before you have written your masterpiece. Masterpiece it is. But the Abbey audience hated it and rioted. They didn't wish to be portrayed as Synge portrayed them. On the first night of The Plough and the Stars by O'Casey, whom Yeats believed had a mind like Dostoevsky, another riot occurred in the Abbey Theatre, which had possibly the most hypersensitive audience in history. Yeats fought back famously, haranguing them from the stage, you have disgraced yourselves again, and he persevered. He had great strength of character, throwing himself into the life of poet, playwright, theatre founder and manager, and senator. He objected notoriously to the outlawing of divorce in the Irish Parliament. That he took such an aggressive stance may seem astonishing. The poems you're about to hear are, in a sense, public poems, reactions to events. In the case of September 1913, to public resistance to the cost of building an art gallery to house Hugh Lane's collection of Impressionist paintings. The refrain, romantic Ireland's dead and gone, calls up a vision of O'Leary, the Fenian leader for whose moral qualities Yeats had great respect, often quoting a line by O'Leary which resonates today, there are things a man must not do to save a nation. Of the Easter Rebellion of 1916 and the leaders, Yeats wrote to Lady Gregory, I had no idea any public event could move me so deeply. And Easter 1916 is one of the greatest political poems in this or any language, in this or any century. The Second Coming, a precursor to the Wasteland, was written in early 1919 after the First World War. Yet it doesn't look back on horror but forward. It's imbued with an apocalyptic vision of what's to come. As he wrote, what is to come has always been there, the rough beast, the beast of the apocalypse. I began to imagine, as always, at my left side, just out of the range of sight, a brazen winged beast, which I associated with laughing, ecstatic destruction. That beast is described in my poem, The Second Coming. It's a frightening, subversive masterpiece. As always, there was tension between these public poems and the longing for the stillness essential to art, of which he once said, "It is a solitary man." That tension is clear in the lovely poem, The Fisherman, the man for whom he wishes to write one poem as cold and passionate as the dawn. The public instinct hovered for more years and was laid to rest, in a sense, with The Ghost of Roger Casement, written many years after Casement was hanged, when Yeats believed that new evidence proved that the notorious diaries were forged. We now know, of course, they were not. After this poem, he said, "I'm finished with politics. That's over." The last poem in this section, Sailing to Byzantium, with its marvelous opening line, "This is no country for old men," like The Fisherman, celebrates art, which may gather us into the artifice of eternity, and thus on a golden bough to sing to lords and ladies of Byzantium. But first, back to September 1913.
September 1913. What need you, being come to sense, but fumble in a greasy till, and add the halfpence to the pence, and prayer to shivering prayer, until you have dried the marrow from the bone? For men were born to pray and save. Romantic Ireland's dead and gone. It's with O'Leary in the grave. Yet they were of a different kind, the names that stilled your childish play. They have gone about the world like wind, but little time had they to pray, for whom the hangman's rope was spun. And what, God help us, could they save? Romantic Ireland's dead and gone. It's with O'Leary in the grave. Was it for this the wild geese spread the grey wing upon every tide? For this that all that blood was shed? For this Edward Fitzgerald died, and Robert Emmet, and Wolfe Tone? All that delirium of the brave? Romantic Ireland's dead and gone. It's with O'Leary in the grave. Yet could we turn the years again and call those exiles as they were in all their loneliness and pain, you'd cry, some woman's yellow hair has maddened every mother's son. They weighed so lightly what they gave. But let them be. They're dead and gone. They're with O'Leary in the grave.
(1916). I have met them at close of day, coming with vivid faces from counter or desk among grey 18th century houses. I've passed with a nod of the head, or polite, meaningless words, or have lingered a while and said polite, meaningless words, or have thought before I had done of a mocking tale or a jibe to please a companion round the fire of the club, being certain that they and I but lived where motley is worn. All changed. Changed utterly. A terrible beauty is born. That woman's days were spent in ignorant goodwill, her nights in argument till her voice grew shrill. What voice more sweet than hers, when young and beautiful she rode to harriers? That man had kept a school and rode our winged horse. The other, his helper and friend, was coming into the force. He might have won fame in the end, so sensitive his nature seemed, so daring and sweet his thought. This other man I had dreamed a drunken, vainglorious lout. He had done most bitter wrong to some who are near my heart, yet I number him in the song. He too has resigned his part in the casual comedy. He too has been changed in his turn, transformed utterly. A terrible beauty is born. Hearts with one purpose alone, through summer and winter seem enchanted to a stone. To trouble the living stream, the horse that comes from the road, the rider, the birds that range from cloud to tumbling cloud, minute by minute they change. A shadow of cloud on the stream changes minute by minute. A horse hoof slides on the brim and a horse plashes within it. The long-legged moor hens dive, the hens to moorcocks call. Minute by minute they live, the stones in the midst of all. Too long a sacrifice can make a stone of the heart. Oh, when may it suffice? That is heaven's part. Our part, to murmur name upon name, as a mother names her child, when sleep at last has come on limbs that had run wild. What is it but nightfall? No, no, not night, but death. Was it needless death, after all? For England may keep faith for all that is done and said. We know their dream. Enough to know they dreamed and are dead. And what if excessive love bewildered them till they died? I write it out in verse. McDonagh and McBride, and Connolly and Pierce, now and in time to be, wherever green is worn, are changed, changed utterly. A terrible beauty is born.
The fisherman, although I can see him still, the freckled man who goes to a grey place on a hill in grey Connemara clothes at dawn to cast his flies. It's long since I began to call up to the eyes this wise and simple man. All day I'd looked in the face what I had hoped 'twould be to write for my own race and the reality. The living men that I hate, the craven man in his seat, the dead man that I loved, the insolent unreproved. And no knave brought to book who has won a drunken cheer, the witty man and his joke aimed at the commonest ear, the clever man who cries the catch cries of the clown, the beating down of the wise and great art beaten down. Maybe a 12-month since, suddenly I began, in scorn of this audience, imagining a man and his sun-freckled face and grey Connemara cloth, climbing up to a place where stone is dark under froth, and the downturn of his wrist when the flies drop in the stream. A man who does not exist, a man who is but a dream, and cried, "Before I am old, I shall have written him one poem, maybe as cold and passionate as the dawn."
The ghost of Roger Casement. Oh, what has made that sudden noise? What on the threshold stands? It never crossed the sea, because John Bull and the sea are friends. But this is not the old sea, nor this the old seashore. What gave that roar of mockery, that roar in the sea's roar? The ghost of Roger Casement is beating on the door. John Bull has stood for Parliament, a dog must have his day. The country thinks no end of him, for he knows how to say at a bean feast or a banquet that all must hang their trust upon the British Empire, upon the Church of Christ. The ghost of Roger Casement is beating on the door. John Bull has gone to India, and all must pay him heed, for histories are there to prove that none of another breed has had a like inheritance or sucked such milk as he. And there's no look about a house if it lacks honesty. The ghost of Roger Casement is beating on the door. I poked about a village church and found his family tomb, and copied out what I could read in that religious gloom. Found many a famous man there, but fame and virtue rot. Draw round, beloved, and bitter men. Draw round and raise a shout, The ghost of Roger Casement is beating on the door.
The second coming, turning and turning in the widening gyre. The falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart. The center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Surely some revelation is at hand. Surely the second coming is at hand. The second coming. Hardly are those words out when a vast image out of Spiritus Mundi troubles my sight. Somewhere in sands of the desert, a shape with lion body and the head of a man, a gaze, blank and pitiless as the sun, is moving its slow thighs, while all about it reel shadows of indignant desert birds. The darkness drops again, but now I know the 20 centuries of stony sleep were vexed to nightmare by a rocking cradle. And what rough beast, its hour come round at last, slouches towards Bethlehem to be born?
To Byzantium. That is no country for old men, the young in one another's arms, birds in the trees, those dying generations at their song. The salmon falls, the mackerel crowded seas, fish, flesh or fowl, commend all summer long whatever is begotten, born and dies. Caught in that sensual music, all neglect monuments of unaging intellect. An aged man is but a paltry thing, a tattered coat upon a stick. Unless soul clap its hands and sing, and louder sing, for every tatter in its mortal dress. Nor is there singing school but studying monuments of its own magnificence. And therefore I have sailed the seas and come to the holy city of Byzantium. O sages, standing in God's holy fire, as in the gold mosaic of a wall, come from the holy fire, burn in a gyre, and be the singing masters of my soul. Consume my heart away, sick with desire, and fastened to a dying animal. It knows not what it is, and gather me into the artifice of eternity. Once out of nature, I shall never take my bodily form from any natural thing, but such a form as Grecian goldsmiths make of hammered gold and gold enameling, to keep a drowsy emperor awake, or set upon a golden bough to sing to lords and ladies of Byzantium of what is past or passing or to come.
One never tires of life, he wrote, and at the last must die of thirst with the cup at one's lip. Late Yeats is extraordinary. Some of his finest poems were written in the last 6 or 7 years of his life. With courage rooted in his capacity for experience, he now gives us the barbarism of truth. In dreams, he once wrote, begins responsibility. And the summing up is harsh in many of them. Did that play of mine send out certain men the English shot? The echo answers, lie down and die. Some of the most quoted lines in Eliot's masterpiece, Four Quartets, are spoken in the voice of the older Yeats. They concern the gifts reserved for age, the cold friction of expiring sense, the impotence of rage at human folly, the laceration of laughter at what ceases to amuse, the rending pain of reenactment of all that you have done and been. Of Yeats's last poems, Eliot said, "To what honest man, old enough, can these sentiments be alien? The poems, What Then, sang Plato's ghost, The Spur, why should not old men be mad? Meru, but man's life is thought, and he, despite his terror, cannot cease ravening through century after century, ravening, raging, and uprooting, that he may come into the desolation of reality. The Municipal Gallery Revisited, with its lovely last line about friendship, is a kinder summing up. Then we have the mysterious, austere, long-legged fly, suggesting, as it does, that violent historical events and art may begin in strange stillness, under which, as Seamus Heaney tells us, lies in this poem an implacable artistic drive. It's a difficult poem, but worth the time. The circus animal's desertion is possibly the truest poem ever written about creativity. We end with the ironically titled Politics, a late poem in which at one point he wanted to stand as the last poem in his last collection. In it, Yeats returns with an exhausted sweetness to the universal theme of love, agreeing, it would seem, with Browning, love is best. But first to What Then?
What then? His chosen comrades thought at school he must grow a famous man. He thought the same and lived by rule, all his 20s crammed with toil. What then? Sang Plato's ghost. What then? Everything he wrote was read. After certain years, he won sufficient money for his need, friends that have been friends indeed. What then? Sang Plato's ghost. What then? All his happier dreams came true. A small old house, wife, daughter, son, grounds where plum and cabbage grew, poets and wits about him drew. What then? Sang Plato's ghost. What then? The work is done, grown old, he thought, according to my boyish plan. Let the fools rage, I swerved in naught, something to perfection brought. But louder sang that ghost. What then?
The Spur. You think it horrible that lust and rage should dance attendance upon my old age? They were not such a plague when I was young. What else have I to spur me into song?
Why should not old men be mad? Some have known a likely lad that had a sound fly fisher's wrist turn to a drunken journalist. A girl that knew all Dante once lived to bear children to a dunce. A Helen of social welfare dream climb on a wagonette to scream. Some think it a matter of course that chance should starve good men and bad advance. That if their neighbours figured plain as though upon a lighted screen, no single story would they find of an unbroken, happy mind, a finish worthy of the start. Young men know nothing of this sort. Observant old men know it well. And when they know what old books tell, and that no better can be had, know why an old man should be mad.
Meru. Civilization is hooped together, brought under a rule, under the semblance of peace by manifold illusion. But man's life is thought, and he, despite his terror, cannot cease ravening through century after century, ravening, raging, and uprooting, that he may come into the desolation of reality. Egypt and Greece, goodbye, and goodbye Rome. Hermits upon Mount Meru or Everest, caverned in night under the drifted snow, or where that snow and winter's dreadful blast beat down upon their naked bodies, know that the day brings round the night, that before dawn his glory and his monuments are gone.
The Municipal Gallery Revisited. Around me, the images of 30 years. An ambush, pilgrims at the waterside, casement upon trial, half hidden by the bars, guarded. Griffith staring in hysterical pride. Kevin O'Higgins' countenance that wears a gentle, questioning look that cannot hide a soul incapable of remorse or rest. A revolutionary soldier kneeling to be blessed. An abbot or archbishop with an upraised hand, blessing the tricolour. This is not, I say, the dead Ireland of my youth, but an Ireland that poets have imagined, terrible and gay. Before a woman's portrait, suddenly I stand, beautiful and gentle in her Venetian way. I met her all but 50 years ago for 20 minutes in some studio. Heart-smitten with emotion, I sink down, my heart recovering with covered eyes. Wherever I had looked upon my permanent or impermanent images. Augusta Gregory's son, her sister's son, Hugh Lane, the only begetter of all these, Hazel Lavery, living and dying. That tale as though some ballad singer had sung it all. Mancini's portrait of Augusta Gregory. Greatest since Rembrandt, according to John Synge. A great ebullient portrait, certainly, but where is the brush that could show anything of all that pride and that humility? And I am in despair that time may bring approved patterns of women or of men, but not that self-same excellence again. My medieval knees lack health until they bend, but in that woman, in that household where honor had lived so long, all lacking found. Childless, I thought, my children may find here deep-rooted things, but never foresaw its end. And now that the end has come, I have not wept. No fox can foul the lair the badger swept. An image out of Spenser and the common tongue. John Synge, I, and Augusta Gregory thought that all that we did, all that we said or sang, must come from contact with the soil. From that contact, everything Antaeus-like grew strong. We three alone in the modern times had brought everything down to that soul test again. Dream of the noble and the beggar man. And here's John Synge himself, that rooted man, forgetting human words, a grave, deep face. You that would judge me, do not judge alone this book or that. Come to this hallowed place, where my friends' portraits hang, and look thereon. Ireland's history in their lineaments trace. Think where man's glory most begins and ends, and say my glory was, I had such friends.
Long-legged fly, that civilization may not sink, his great battle lost. Quiet the dog, tether the pony to a distant post. Our master Caesar is in the tent where the maps are spread, his eyes fixed upon nothing, a hand under his head. Like a long-legged fly upon the stream, his mind moves upon silence. That the topless towers be burnt, and men recall that face, move most gently, if move you must, in this lonely place. She thinks part woman, 3 parts a child, that nobody looks. Her feet practice a tinker shuffle picked up on the street. Like a long-legged fly upon the stream, her mind moves upon silence. That girls at puberty may find the first Adam in their thought. Shut the door of the Pope's chapel, keep those children out. There on that scaffolding reclines Michelangelo. With no more sound than the mice make, his hand moves to and fro. Like a long-legged fly upon the stream, his mind moves upon silence. The circus animal's desertion. I sought a theme and sought for it in vain. I sought it daily for 6 weeks or so. Maybe at last, being but a broken man, I must be satisfied with my heart. Although winter and summer till old age began, my circus animals were all on show. Those stilted boys, that burnished chariot, lion and woman and the Lord knows what. What can I but enumerate old themes? First that sea rider Oisin, led by the nose through 3 enchanted islands, allegorical dreams, vain gaiety, vain battle, vain repose. Themes of the embittered heart, or so it seems, that might adorn old songs or courtly shows. But what cared I that set them on to ride? I starved for the bosom of his fairy bride. And then a counter-truth filled out this play. The Countess Kathleen was the name I gave it. She, pity-crazed, had given her soul away, but masterful heaven had intervened to save it. I thought my dear must her own soul destroy. So did fanaticism and hate enslave it. And this brought forth a dream, and soon enough, this dream itself had all my thought and love. And when the fool and blind man stole the bread, Cuchulainn fought the ungovernable sea. Heart mysteries there, and yet when all is said, it was the dream itself enchanted me. Character isolated by a deed to engross the present and dominate memory. Players and painted stage took all my love, and not those things that they were emblems of. Those masterful images, because complete, grew in pure mind, but out of what began? A mound of refuge, the sweepings of a street, old kettles, old bottles, and a broken can, old iron, old bones, old rags, that raving slut who keeps the till. Now that my ladder's gone, I must lie down where all the ladders start, in the foul rag and bone shop of the heart.
Politics. How can I, that girl standing there, my attention fix on Roman or on Russian or on Spanish politics? Yet, here's a travelled man that knows what he talks about, and there's a politician that has read and thought, and maybe what they say is true, of war and war's alarms. But oh, that I were young again and held her in my arms.